I think we're good to start, Noah.
Go ahead, Kimberly.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberly Weinberg. I am the president of Temple Beth El up in Bradford and host of this evening's program. This is the first of this year's excellent programming under the auspices of the Western Pennsylvania Small Congregations Initiative, which brings together 13 congregations from the region. The conveners of this group are the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh and the Jewish Community Legacy Project. The JCLP works exclusively with small congregations around the country, helping them to address their current and future needs. Before we start tonight's program, I'd like to tell you what other programs during the year will be. In January, Eric Lidgy, director of the Rao Jewish Archives, will return to speak about small-town Jews and their Gentile neighbors. And in April and May, Mike Roatman of Congregation Havath Achim in Carnegie will present 2 programs about Jews and Broadway. There will be flyers about these exceptional programs and information for registration. So a few logistical details for tonight. This program is being recorded and will be on the Jewish Legacy Project YouTube channel. We ask that you keep your screen muted. You can also post questions or comments in the chat room, and we will relay them to Rabbi Schiff for your response. So now it is time for me to introduce Rabbi Schiff. When we originally thought about asking him to do this program, it was to talk about the judicial situation in Israel. And we could not have imagined what would have happened. Our hearts go out to the Israel people, to the hostages, to the families who have lost loved ones, to Israel soldiers, indeed to the entire country. No one is more able to place these events in context for us than Rabbi Schiff. Dr. Danny Schiff is the Gefsky Community Scholar at the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. He is a noted teacher and researcher in Jewish ethics. Rabbi Schiff previously served as the Community Scholar for the Agency for Jewish Learning in Pittsburgh, as Rabbi of B'nai Israel in White Oak, Pennsylvania, and as Rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne, Australia. He is the author of Abortion and Judaism, published by Cambridge University Press, and a forthcoming book on the future of non-Orthodox Judaism. He is a former ethics board and the Society of Jewish Ethics. Last year, Rabbi Schiff spoke to us about the A to Z of anti-Zionism, and tonight he will speak about Israel's existential situation. We'll hear from him for about 45 minutes. Is that right, Noah? And then we'll open it up to questions. I'm sure people will have questions. So Rabbi Schiff, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Kimberly, I appreciate the introduction, and I must say that I'm very grateful to be in the presence of all of you. There are many faces in this group that I recognize, and that brings me comfort, but more particularly at a time like this, being together with my Jewish extended family is a very important opportunity, because we can derive some measure of relief from the horrific events that are happening in Israel through sharing them together. And it's my hope that after I speak tonight, we'll have the opportunity to have something of a conversation about what's going on. I'm grateful to Kimberly for telling you about my bio, but the one important feature that some of you know and some of you don't know is that I am an Israeli citizen, and that I spend half my year in Jerusalem. In other words, I'm fall and spring in Pittsburgh, and I'm winter and summer in Jerusalem. My family lives in Jerusalem, and I have a daughter who is back in the armed forces as we speak because of the reserve call up, and a son who was working in intelligence. So I come to you tonight not just as an Israeli and not just as somebody who has given a lot of thought to the place of Israel in Jewish history, but also as somebody who is very much personally engaged. And I think that that really applies to all of us in this virtual room. After all, in the last 10 days, and they've been a very long 10 days, in the last 10 days, we have plunged into deep mourning as a people, and there we very much remain. We should recall for many weeks and months to come what happened on October 7th and never erase the memories of that particular brutal day and its aftermath. Let's just remind ourselves that almost 1,400 Israelis lost their lives. They didn't just lose their lives, they were murdered in the most pitiless, brutal, barbaric, inhuman way imaginable. Not only, as you're aware, was it the single most bloody day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, but in many ways it imitated the Holocaust in its cruelty, in its barbarism, and in the disgusting way in which people were literally raped, tortured, and maimed on that day. And we should remember as well, of course, that there are now more than 4,000 Israelis who have been injured, who were injured on that day and have suffered injuries in the days since. And our hearts and our prayers go out particularly for the almost 200 hostages, those held captive by Hamas in Gaza, whose fate is unknown, and we shudder. We shudder to think of what they are experiencing, because captivity is always a very, very painful and difficult circumstance, but at the hands of Hamas, how much the more so is that the case. In many ways, we are being exposed to eras, periods of Jewish history that we had thought were long behind us. There is a very rich halachic literature about what to do when Jews get taken captive, because it happens so often in the Middle Ages. All the various different texts about how to think through the ethical dilemmas that having Jews be taken captive represented for a Jewish community. We thought that for the most part, that was all theoretical material. Most people here will remember Gilad Shalit. Gilad Shalit, who was in captivity in Gaza for 5 years. He was one individual. And for that one individual, for 5 years, we prayed and we worked and we remembered and we did everything possible to get him home. And now, tonight, here we sit with a captive situation that is 200 times worse than it was when Gilad Shalit was in captivity. 200 individuals, all with families, friends, associates, people that they know. The pain of all those deaths, all those pitiless deaths, all those injuries, all those who are in captivity, the pain is almost unbearable. Not just for Israelis, for all of us. Most everybody in this virtual room has friends or family in Israel. We are a people that is deeply connected. And perhaps the statistic that is most chilling of all is the reality that Israel counted no less than 1,500 dead terrorists on Israeli soil. So if there were 1,500 dead terrorists on Israeli soil, that means that in all likelihood, something approaching 2,000 young men crossed through the Gaza fence early on the morning of October 7th and launched this massive attack, which led to this extraordinary loss of life and this gruesome feast of death that ensued. Think about that for a moment. 2,000 young men, each one of whom was fully capable and fully prepared to murder Holocaust survivors, to burn women alive, to tie people up and plunge knives into their bodies, to throw grenades into shelters that contained young people, to shoot at a music festival. Would your children or grandchildren be capable of such an act? What does it take to educate a young person to see such a possibility as being virtuous, as being the appropriate thing to do? How long do you have to drip the poison of Jew hatred into the minds of growing children in order for them to be able to do what they did? It might be true that Hamas was planning this operation for many, many months, but in fact, the educational program, the educational training that led to October 7th took many years and involved a profound level of anti-Semitism, a profound response that said that Jews are so beneath contempt that murdering, raping, burning became a very real possibility. But there's one happy number to remember amidst all of the horror. And the happy number is that Israel has called up some 300,000 reservists. It's the biggest call-up of reserves in Israel's history. Just to provide you with some context, Israel's standing army, the regular army, constitutes about 250,000, which means that Israel has called up more reserves than the entire normal standing army. In excess of 500,000 Israelis tonight are in uniform, which means that the cities are largely quiet as the businesses have all closed down because the young people and not a few of the older people have gone off to the front. The supermarkets are open. You can certainly get your basic needs. But other than that, the streets of Israel are for the most part deserted on a war footing. And we, the Jewish people tonight, are very much at war. In that war effort, what is truly remarkable is that Israelis have come together in a way that I think is fair to describe as unprecedented. But you remember what I was supposed to be talking about tonight. What I was supposed to be talking about tonight, what we all expected was going to be on the fall agenda, were the deep divisions in Israeli society. Remember that up until October 7th, all the conversation that was going on revolved around, was Israel inching towards some form of civil war? Civil war wasn't just mentioned once or twice. It was in all the newspapers and all the television and radio broadcasts. Was there a possibility that ultimately, like the United States had gone through in other countries, that Israel would take up arms internally where brother would fight brother, where we would have this internal struggle? And in such a Jewish fashion, but with a whiplash that is never, that I don't think has ever before been seen in a country, Israel goes overnight from a state of being on the verge of a possible civil war to being in a state of what might be best described as civil embrace, a massive civil solidarity of the First Order. Today in Israel, all the divisions that were so evident, all the fissures in Israeli society that were so obvious for the first 10 months, the first 10 months of this government, they've all disappeared. People have come together in the most extraordinary way possible. El Al has flown more than 100,000 Israelis home again. People who didn't need to necessarily show up, but who absolutely were determined to come to the aid of Israeli society in these circumstances. In fact, there was a report today that says that El Al has allowed people to sit on the floor on a number of their flights because they didn't have enough seats on the plane to sit on the floor in order to get home, and people were prepared to sit on the floor in order to get back to Israel. There is this extraordinary determination. My daughter, who works in HR on her base, informs me that they have many people showing up who never actually got a call instructing them to show up. They simply pulled out the old uniform. And these are people in their 40s and 50s who certainly were not required to be there, pulled out the old uniform out of the closet and showed up anyway. And every Israeli who's not in uniform is trying to find a way to help. From the young teenagers who came to Har Herzl, the cemetery, the military cemetery in Jerusalem, and helped dig graves because there were not enough grave diggers, to the B'nai Akiva youth who went and swept the floors and cleaned hospitals when the hospitals were understaffed. Everybody is trying to find a way to help out and to be there for each other. One heartwarming story is typical. A young Brazilian immigrant, relatively new immigrant, was among those killed, murdered at the music festival. And the only relatives she had in Israel were her mother and her sister. And they were concerned that they might not have a minyan for her funeral. So the word went out. Would a few people come along? So they should be able to make up a minyan for her funeral. 10,000 people showed up at her funeral. Obviously, people who never knew her. And that story is being repeated time and again as we continue to bury the dead, because the dead are still far from all buried. And in the days and weeks ahead, we will continue to be a people mourning the losses. Let's talk a little about the reality of Jewish life. B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. In every generation, they arise against us to try to wipe us out. So says the Haggadah. And sometimes in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we might have thought that we had left those periods, those dark centuries of Jewish history behind. But it's pretty clear, given that this was the bloodiest single day since the Holocaust, it's pretty clear that there are still groups in Jewish history who desperately want to ensure that there will be a world without Jews. What is Hamas? It's time that we talked openly and directly about what Hamas represents. Let's be very clear. Hamas is not the same thing as the Palestinian people. They are not congruent. Hamas is a terrorist group. That's not my definition. That's the State Department's definition. That's the European Union's definition. Hamas is a terrorist group that was elected by the people of Gaza to lead them in 2006. You'll remember that Israel withdrew voluntarily, unilaterally from Gaza in 2005. Elections were held in 2006, and the people of Gaza elected Hamas. That doesn't mean that everybody in Gaza loves Hamas. It simply means that they were popular enough to get elected, and the opinion polls show that they remain fairly popular in Gaza, and even in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is in charge. If there were elections held today in the West Bank, it seems likely that Hamas would probably win those elections as well, which is why Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, has been in charge without elections for more than a decade and a half at this particular juncture. What does Hamas stand for? Hamas is an acronym. In Arabic, the word Hamas, the three letters that it represents in Arabic, stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. Islamic Resistance Movement. What exactly are they resisting? They are resisting the existence of the State of Israel. Again, this is not my spin. This is their charter. Go read the Hamas charter. It's online. It's translated into English. Their more radical version that they put out in 1988, and then a somewhat softened version that they put out in 2017, tells us absolutely explicitly the following. Hamas has no interest in a two-state solution. Hamas believes that negotiations under the supervision of any international forum are entirely worthless. Hamas has only one vision, and that vision is to create a singular state from the river to the sea. And in that singular state, there will exist an Islamic Waqf and an Islamic authority that will look pretty similar to what the Taliban looks like in Afghanistan. And if you ask the question, which would be appropriate to ask, so what would be the place of Jews in that particular state? October the 7th tells you exactly what their formula is, because they say in their covenant that the way to get to this Islamic state that the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, envisages, the way to get to this Islamic state is through jihad. So there are one of two possible fates for the Jews of the land of Israel as far as the Hamas declared program envisages it. Either they get murdered or they get subjugated. Subjugated to the whims and the fate of an Islamic state. Now, it just so happens that the word Hamas in Arabic is also a term that actually has meaning. They chose it because not only is it an acronym for Islamic resistance movement, but also because it means strength or zeal in Arabic. Not surprising that they took a term that references zealotry, strength or zeal. So in Arabic, Hamas clearly indicates that their position is resistance, jihad, and therefore that murdering Jews is not some bug in the system, not some over-enthusiastic group of 2,000 young men who got into their heads to do something that was rather rash and erratic, but absolutely central to the philosophy. It teaches us something very important. When people say that they have a particular agenda, believe them. Which, of course, reminds us that Hamas itself is simply a client of a bigger network. We all know that the Iranians are the ones who supply Hamas with funding, supply Hamas with weapons, and ultimately stand behind the ideology. Nobody here needs to be reminded that Iranian leader after Iranian leader, since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, has said that the Zionist entity needs to be wiped off the map, needs to be obliterated. And every time people in the West say, oh, it's just exaggerated language, they surely don't mean anything of the sort, we should remind them. Take people at their word. The Nazis said it before they did it. Hamas wrote it before they did it. And every time the Iranians repeat it, we should understand it to mean that they are sincere, that they mean it precisely. And that's why the Iranians helped support and fund and expand Hamas. And that's why they also are doing the same with Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and why there is a very strong chance that they might well unleash the forces of Hezbollah at some point or other in the weeks and months to come. And that's why they also have some control over what goes on in Syria in order to surround Israel with Iranian proxies that will do their bidding in trying to bring Israel to an end. But here's the interesting thing with the word Hamas. Not only does it mean Islamic resistance movement, not only in Arabic is it strength or zeal, but there's actually a Hebrew word, Hamas, as well. Completely different from the Arabic word. One's written in Arabic, the other's written in Hebrew. And today, when we write Hamas, the terror organization in Hebrew, we write it Chet Mem Aleph Samach. But there's a word from classic Hebrew, Hamas, without the Aleph, Chet Mem Samach. Where do you find the word Hamas in Hebrew for the first time? Guess what? You find it in this week's Torah portion. For the first time ever, we encounter the word Hamas in this week's Torah portion, Noah. Vatimaleh haaretz Hamas. It says in the Torah portion. And the whole earth was filled with Hamas. What does Hamas mean to the Hebrew ear? Nothing to do with the Arabic word. What does Hamas mean when we encounter it in the Torah? And the whole earth was filled with Hamas. Well, let's recall why God needed Noah. God needed Noah because there was extraordinary evil throughout the entire world. God recognized that the primary problem that God needed to address was how to control human evil, human misconduct. So bad was it that God's solution, as you know, was mass capital punishment. That's what the flood represents. That God would wipe out every single human being that lived because of the problem of human misbehavior, the problem of human evil. But Timaleha Aretz Hamas, and the whole earth was filled with Hamas. What is the translation of Hamas in Hebrew? It's one of two things. Either violence or lawlessness. And the whole earth was filled with Hamas. The whole earth was filled with violence. The whole earth was filled with lawlessness. How chilling that you could translate it as the whole land was filled with Hamas. The whole land was filled with violence. To the Hebrew ear, Hamas doesn't mean strength. It means violence. It means lawlessness. And how extraordinary it is that Hamas has lived up to its Hebrew title in both senses, violence and lawlessness. And how even more extraordinary that, as you know, the first 11 chapters of the Torah never mention Jews. It's a universal account. It's about all of humanity. But in the 12th chapter, we encounter Jews, Abraham and Sarah, for the first time. And why does God need Jews? What's the point of having Jews? What are we all about? We were brought onto the scene, my friends, in order to deal with the human problem that God was having real trouble resolving. But Timaleh haaretz Hamas, and the whole earth was filled with violence and lawlessness. And when God swept them all away in the flood, it didn't end the problem, because 10 generations elapsed from Noah to Abraham. And in those 10 generations, human misconduct and human evil persisted. And so God decided that perhaps the best way to get human beings on track would be if a few members of a family, ultimately to grow into a nation, would take on the job of being role models for a more exalted, more worthy type of civilization. And that's why God brought Jews into existence. You could say, perfectly reasonably, that the reason there are Jews in the world is because of the problem, Vatimaleh haaretz Hamas, that the whole earth was filled with violence and lawlessness, and we Jews are the response to that. That we are supposed to live our lives in an exemplary fashion and demonstrate how we can set ourselves apart from violence and lawlessness and transcend that sort of misconduct. That is why there are Jews. There are Jews in order to respond to the problem of Hamas. It was true back then, and it seems like it's true today. In fact, people have asked me, what can we do as American Jews in this circumstance? We feel so hopeless. We want to help. What can we do? To which my response is 3 things. Number 1, and I know you've done this, if you have friends or relatives in Israel, reach out to them and make sure that they know that you are supporting them and behind them, and that you sympathize with them, and that you are going to be there for the long term. And then don't stop. Keep doing that. Because if you did it once, that's great. But there are going to be very tough days and weeks ahead. We haven't yet finished with the difficulty and the suffering and the pain. So keep calling, keep being in touch. That's number 1. Number 2, and here I don't usually talk about money, but I will because the moment calls for it, give money. However little or much you can give money over and beyond what you usually give. There are all sorts of places that are collecting money for Israel, and you might say, but I thought Israel was quite prosperous, to which the answer is, Israel is quite prosperous, but the needs now are overwhelming. Just think about this. Think about what the mental health needs are going to be in Israel, not just in the month ahead, not just in the year ahead, but for decades to come. Not just for the hundreds and hundreds of families who had a murdered individual in their family, not just for the injured, not just for those who have had their loved ones taken into captivity, but for all Israelis in one way or another. The collective trauma that has been suffered. And if you say, well, isn't it the job of the government of Israel to take care of that? The answer is yes, partially, but they won't do the whole job. And I could go down a whole list. The Ethiopian and Ukrainian new immigrants who have been in Israel just for a few months and who have no capacity to be able to have some sort of resilience in these circumstances, they need help desperately. The government can't do it all. So there are a whole range of different areas in which our money, our monetary gifts can and will make a difference. And I hope that 100% of the people on this call tonight will find it in themselves to give something. because every bit is going to be important. And the third thing, and I think the third thing is probably the most significant as far as I'm concerned. The third thing is that anti-Semites and brutal murderers of Jews would love nothing more than that you and I should be cowed into submission and walk away from our Judaism. That we should not be the ones who offer a solution to the problem of Hamas in the world, that we should disappear. So the best response to what happened is to carry oneself proudly as a Jew in the world, in public, and to increase one's commitment to Jewish life. To be the Jewish response that chapter 12 of Bereshit suggests is the answer to the Hamas that we find in chapter 6. To continue to say, we will stand up for a very different model of Judaism than that which we have, for a very different model of how a human being can conduct themselves in the world than that which is evident in the behavior of Hamas. So here's the question. What's going to happen next? Everybody wants to know what is going to be the likely scenario in the weeks and months to come. So I want to tell you two things. First of all, clearly there will be a ground operation. There are tens of thousands of Israeli troops on the Gaza border right now. There are also tens of thousands of troops on the northern border. There will clearly be a ground operation because Hamas has made it abundantly obvious that Israel cannot possibly tolerate the threat that they might be left with a capacity to ever strike us like that again, which means that any Israeli government would take it upon itself to root out the evil that Hamas represents in such a way that they can never hurt us in the way that they did on October 7th ever again. Now, you might be asking yourself the question, really? Can they do that? Is that even possible? Doesn't Hamas represent a philosophy and ideology so you can kill lots of people, but it doesn't necessarily in any way take away that philosophy or ideology? To which I think the best response is this. One of the most touching things that I have seen in the last 10 days is the fact that many of the countries that are friends of Israel have lit up national monuments in blue and white. But the most extraordinary of all, of course, was the Brandenburg Gate. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, which was not just lit up in blue and white, but it was lit up with a huge Israeli flag across the top with the Magen David front and center on the Brandenburg Gate. The Brandenburg Gate, from which the Nazis hung huge swastikas and through which the Nazis held their victory parades. If you had told our grandparents 80 years ago, in 1943, that there would come a day when the Brandenburg Gate would be lit up in blue and white with a Magen David front and center for all to see in solidarity with the Jewish people around the world, standing shoulder to shoulder with the single 75-year-old independent state of the Jewish people. If you had told them that in 1943, they would never have believed you. So don't tell me it's impossible to uproot an ideology. Don't tell me it's impossible to transform a people into a different way of seeing the future. It's possible. It's possible if they want it. And we have to be exemplars of why living in the world in the way that we seek to is a better alternative. So prediction number one is there will be a ground war. And that ground war will not be completed until Israel is satisfied that the long-term threat from Hamas has been neutralized. Prediction number 2. The government, the Israeli government that was elected last November, took office at the end of December, is history. Bibi Netanyahu will not be the prime minister for much longer. So long as the war goes on, we will keep the leaders we have. But there is fury, great fury in Israeli society about the immense failures of the political echelon, the military echelon, the intelligence echelon of Israeli society. And in many ways, the people are rallying around, supporting each other, even though their leaders, our leaders, failed us badly. There is no conceivable scenario, as far as I can tell, in which the prime minister survives that. This is an earthquake in Israeli and Jewish history. Nothing will be the same post-October the 7th as it was pre-October the 7th. We will see different politicians, different configurations, different goals in Israeli society. I fully expect that because of October 7th, we're still going to have a fairly right-wing type of government in Israel, but it will be led by people who are much more likely to have competence in the various different areas of governing rather than the group that is currently in power. Last thing I want to say. This will come to be known in time, I expect, as the Simchat Torah war. After all, that's when it started. It was a war that was launched against innocent civilians. It was a war designed to hurt innocent civilians. And we should tell everybody who is confused about this point that there is a dramatic asymmetry between a group, Hamas, that is prepared to attack and murder innocent civilians and who gleefully celebrates their gruesome deaths on the one hand, and a people who inevitably understands that some innocent civilians will have to die in defending Israel against Hamas, but who deeply mourn and regret that reality. What's that old saying that was attributed to Golda Meir? We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but we can never forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. There is a profound asymmetry between those who regard it as a moral virtue to kill the innocent, to murder, maim, and rape, versus those who sometimes have to be placed in a situation where innocent civilians will be killed, but who deeply mourn that reality. And let me say, obviously, this evening, many of us are thinking about the destruction of that hospital in Gaza late today, which seems pretty plainly to have been brought about by an errant Islamic Jihad rocket. But as a Jew, I think I speak for all feeling Jews, and certainly for Judaism as a system, when I say that we deeply regret every one of those lives that was lost. It brings tears to us. There is no joy like the joy that was exhibited on the streets of Gaza on October 7th.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So,
I know we have at least one question in the chat, and if you would like to ask questions, you can raise your hand on the little raise hand icon. And meanwhile, we have our first question is, how do we have discussions with progressive liberal Jewish left who do not support Israel?
Well, I think that this is a very clarifying moment. And I think that the clarifying aspect of this is that anybody who finds themselves unable to offer a full and unqualified condemnation of what Hamas did on October 7th without trying to balance it or offer justifications that speak about both sides or some form of offering excuses. I think that person who can't offer a full condemnation effectively has separated themselves from the civilized conversation entirely. And that person, therefore, we can't have coherent interaction with those who regard the murder of innocence as being something that they can raise up and explain. So I don't know if that is what would be true among progressive liberal Jews, but to the extent it is, then conversations with people who can't issue that sort of condemnation becomes very problematic. Those Jews in the Jewish community who are concerned about the reality that we have had to be in charge of the territories and to control and to be partially in control of the fate of the Palestinians for a very long time. I think we all share that particular concern, but obviously that concern is going to be solved when the Palestinians decide that they're ready to live alongside us. That's the major sticking point in moving things forward. But let's always remember in this conversation that that's not what Hamas is interested in. Hamas doesn't represent the problem of the Arab-Israel conflict. Hamas is about jihad and the genocide of the Jewish people.
We have a question from Noah.
First of all, Rabbi, thank you so much. I mean, you talked nonstop for 45 minutes and everything was just so clear and concise and informative and moving. So thank you. My question is, it seems to me that the response from the Arab world seems to be muted as compared to what we have seen before. Can you speak about that? And also, can you also speak about what you think the role, the moral role or the political role of the Palestinian Authority should be in this? It seemed to me that they have a wonderful opportunity if they don't squander it. So first, the role of the Arab world, and then more specifically, the role of the PA.
Well, I'm very concerned about the Arab world. I think that while it is true that their response has been muted, I would have liked to have seen a more full-throated condemnation of Hamas than came from most quarters, where the condemnation ranges from tepid to non-existent. Let's remember, we have peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan and the UAE and Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan, and I am concerned. I think we all should be concerned that those peace treaties might become more frayed as the conflict goes on and potentially expands. So those treaties were hard won, and in the case of the treaties with Egypt and Jordan, have been in place for a very long time and represent stable relationships that Israel has. I am concerned, and I think we should all be worried that this conflict, and Hamas would like nothing better, and certainly Iran would like nothing better, that this conflict might well cause some of those relationships to become less strong, less secure, and we need to keep a really close eye on that. The second part of your question, Noah, was what?
Palestinian Authority.
Palestinian Authority, thank you. Palestinian Authority, I think that the Palestinian Authority is probably the direction to which Israel will turn once Hamas no longer rules the Gaza Strip. They'll probably ask the Palestinian Authority to take some responsibility for it. Whether the Palestinian Authority has the bandwidth, the strength to do that is an open question. And there is a lot of mistrust of the Palestinian Authority in Israel, let's face it, because of the way they run things in the West Bank, and their policies of supporting certain terrorist activities in the West Bank as well. And let's face it, the Palestinian Authority has a leader who's in the 19th year of his 4-year term and is in his mid-80s. I'm not suggesting that people in their 80s can't lead countries. We have examples elsewhere where people in their 80s lead countries. I am suggesting that Mahmoud Abbas clearly is not going to be their leader for very long. We don't have much of an idea of how the Palestinian Authority is going to be constituted going forward. So I don't think that, despite the fact you described this as an opportunity for them, I think it's highly unlikely that they're going to grasp it.
Rabbi, and I'm just going to quickly mention that if you have a question, you can at the bottom, and you don't know how to raise your hand, along the bottom that says reactions, and there you can raise your hand, and then it will move your square, and we'll know that you have a question. But and I apologize if I missed this in the beginning because I was having some technical difficulties. But when British Palestine became Israel, wasn't it at that point that there was a Palestinian state? I mean, wasn't Lebanon supposed to be the Palestinian part? Or
the question is how far in history you want to go back? Not Lebanon, but Jordan. But let's not go back too far. Let's go back to 1947. Right? That's 76 years ago. 75 years ago, Israel was established. In 1947, November 29th, 1947, you have the United Nations vote on partition. What's partition mean? Partition means exactly what the word sounds like, which is dividing the land into 2 states, right? A state for the Arabs, read the Palestinians, and a state for the Jews. And as you're all aware, I think Israel accepted that resolution on the Palestinians. The Arabs rejected it. So we had a 2-state solution that was offered and on the table, drawn up with a map and all ready to go in 1947, and the Arabs rejected it then, and they have been rejecting it ever since. For those people who want to offer their friends or family members a very simple way to understand the issue that Israel faces here, just simply say the following: where exactly is the Palestinian map of what they think they would like to have as a state and what they're prepared to leave for Israel as the remaining state? Because the answer to that question is that any Palestinian leader who would actually draw a map and would say, we'll go back to the 1967 borders with some adjustments, and we'll take the West Bank, and we'll take East Jerusalem, and you can have the rest, that Palestinian leader would be assassinated overnight. That's why there's no map, because no Palestinian leader has really been prepared to say that they're ready to live alongside Israel in peace with recognized borders. And the day they do, they'll find Israel ready to sign on the bottom line. Not all Israelis, of course. There will be a vote, and there will be a majority vote in favor in Israel. So the issue, unfortunately, continues to be Palestinian rejectionism of the idea of the 2-state solution. If the Palestinians would embrace it, the Israelis have been wanting it for a long time.
Okay. Does anyone else have for questions for the rabbi? Zeb.
Unmute yourself. Zeb, unmute yourself.
Go ahead.
He was just stretching.
Oh. Well, that was a very coincidental stretch.
Lauren Vivio had a question. How soon can the Israeli government make the change in prime minister?
There will not be a political conversation about the future of the constellation of the Israeli government until the war is behind us. We don't have, not in this country, not in any country, you don't have a fight about politics while the soldiers are in the field. In fact, the extraordinary thing about this moment is that we're hearing on a daily basis people expressing their anger and their fury against the government, because the usual practice in all of Israeli history up until this particular juncture has been never to criticize the political echelon while there is a war going on. Now, today, the first instance in Israeli history where people are very ready to criticize the political echelon even while there's a war going on, but they won't make any changes. So let's wait for the war to be over. Let's pray that it's over quicker than might be expected. And when it is over, I can almost guarantee you that there will be elections, and that in those elections, if the prime minister runs again, which I think is doubtful, but if he were to, I think he will be swept to one side.
Mark Simon has a question. Unmute yourself first.
I'm unmuted. Rabbi, what are your thoughts about Biden heading to Israel today and the fact that the Jordan king and Egypt will not meet with him?
Well, I think that the first thing that one has to say about President Biden is that, and this is not in any way a political observation, but I think that every Jew should give thanks for what he has said and what he has done. After all, his speech last week, I think, will go down in Jewish history as one of the most full-throated support examples of support of the Jewish state that has ever been articulated by a world leader. And when the president said in that speech that if this attack had been made upon the United States, that you can be absolutely sure that the United States would respond with overwhelming force, and those were his words, he was essentially giving Israel a green light to do exactly that, to respond to Hamas with overwhelming force. And as you know, he's moved 2 carrier strike groups to the Eastern Mediterranean in order to indicate clearly that the Iranians should think twice before getting involved. He said in his speech, don't, to the Iranians specifically. And I think that his trip, therefore, tomorrow is going to be a very powerful statement of support for Israel. Now, the reality that the Arab leaders, the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt and the head of the Palestinian Authority, had a meeting lined up with him and decided to cancel that meeting was because they came to the conclusion that Israel was responsible for this particular attack on the hospital. It turns out that they were wrong about that, and it would be admirable if they were to reinstate their meeting. I don't think they will, because it will be a loss of face for them, but it seems to me that they have much more to lose by the meeting being cancelled than does President Biden. What President Biden will demonstrate is the shoulder-to-shoulder support that America is giving to Israel, and that, I think, is going to be the most important part of his trip. Let me say in closing, because I know that we're out of time here.
We have a few more minutes if you want.
Oh, we do? Okay.
We have another question, so we're okay.
Okay.
If you're okay, Rabbi.
I'm okay.
Jerry Kettler asks if you can briefly differentiate between Hamas and Hezbollah.
First of all, Hezbollah is in Lebanon, and one is Shia and one is Sunni. I forget which one is which. They're different strands of Islam, and Hamas obviously operates in Gaza and in the West Bank. They have some presence in other places as well. Hezbollah doesn't have the same sort of genocidal charter as Hamas does. Hamas are much more menacing and fundamentalist, but people with missiles should always be taken seriously. And the Iranians have supplied Hezbollah with something around 100,000, maybe more than 100,000 missiles that are directly aimed at the north of Israel and can reach well south of Jerusalem, even to Beersheba, we suspect. So if and when they decide to unleash them, and the idea of Hezbollah is that they will unleash them in volleys that are large enough that it will overwhelm Iron Dome, that will certainly create a very hairy and problematic situation for Israel. If that sounds alarming, then be aware that obviously the Israeli military has prepared for that possibility and for the possibility of a two-front war. So there are differentiations between the two, but it's important to recognize the similarity. And the similarity is they are both instruments of the Iranian regime designed to be utilized to destabilize and attack Israel on behalf of Iran. And therefore, when we are at war with Hamas or Hezbollah, we are essentially at war with Iran via proxy.
Rabbi Karen Baudouin asks, she says there's a lot of discussion internationally about taking measures as possible to limit Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza and bringing in medical, food, and water. What is Israel's role in that process?
Well, look, I think everybody in this group is aware that Israel's army is Israel's army because it has moral standards, and we're not about to set those to one side. So in every previous campaign in Gaza, we've given civilians warning before there is an attack, and this time around, the same thing has happened plainly. The world will complain whatever we do. If we had told the people of Gaza to stay put in the northern half of Gaza, even though our armed forces were moving into there, the world would have complained that we didn't give them a chance to escape. Now that we warned them and told them that they should move to the southern part of Gaza, the world is complaining that there is a humanitarian problem because moving that many people is a very difficult thing to achieve. So far, there has not been one report of anybody dying of hunger or anybody dying of thirst in Gaza. I would be shocked if there ever were. Israel is not about to let people start dying in the streets of hunger or of starvation. The one thing that we can say with great assurance is that the way in which the Israel Defense Forces will conduct this war in Gaza will be far more accommodating of innocent civilians than if that war were being conducted by any other army in the world. So the people of Gaza, as awful as it's going to be, and let's remind ourselves, war is hell. It's hell right now, and it's going to be worse when the ground troops go in. And in war, there is always untold suffering and terrible deaths. But the truth of the matter is that Israel's army is the most morally upstanding army in the world, and that therefore they will do their utmost to prevent innocent casualties in a way that most other armies would not pay attention to.
Thank you. Any final question?
Let me make a final comment, if I might.
Please, Rabbi.
The Simchat Torah war, if that's what it comes to be known, reminds us, of course, that at the conclusion of every book of the Torah, and certainly on Simchat Torah, we have a line that we say to each other, Chazak, Chazak v'nitchazek. And it strikes me that that's the appropriate greeting that Jews should use at this particular juncture. Chazak, may we be strong here in the diaspora, where we too will need to be strong for the weeks and months ahead. Chazak, may they be strong in the land of Israel for the days of war to come. V'nitchazek, may we strengthen each other as a people, as we have done in the past and as we will do in the days and weeks to come.
And I think we all can say to that, Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. everybody here and those who registered and were not able to attend, we will have the recording of this session in a few days, hopefully tomorrow or the next day. And we just can't thank you enough, Rabbi, for your role in the community and for spending the second year with us. And hopefully next year you'll be with us and it'll be for happy times. Thank you all.
Thank you, Danny. Danny, travel safely.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And safely to your family.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Rabbi.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Hi, Andrea. Andrea, I can hear you now.